It's Tanya. I'm from CanPKU Plus, and I am very excited to welcome Joanne and Lauren from Empower Advocacy. Their mission is to amplify the voices of patients, caregivers, health providers, and communities to drive positive and lasting change within the healthcare landscape. They are rooted in the belief that everyone's voice matters and anyone can make a difference. And they are committed to ensuring that those affected by gaps in the healthcare system are supported and empowered to make their voices heard. They are joined by a guest speaker, Suzanne LePage, who brings extensive expertise in navigating the private payer market and accessing prescription drugs and ensuring better access for treatment for patients through affordable benefit plans. Of course, we also have our advocacy advisor, John Adams, who is a founder of the organization and seasoned leader in the rare disease community with extensive experience advocating patient advocacy, health policies, and equitable access to therapies in Canada. I want to thank you all for being here and presenting on our first of our two-part session, Treatment Approved Now What? A Path to Drug Access in Canada. And I will turn it over to Empower.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Tanya. Thank you, John. Thank you, Nicole, and all of CanPKU Plus for inviting us to chat with your community about drug access and advocacy. This is the first of two webinars, as Tanya just said, and today we're going to be discussing all of the processes involved in Canada for both public and private reimbursement. I'm Joanne Koski. I'm going to be starting us off, and then I will be turning it over to my colleague Lauren, and then to Suzanne to speak about private. So let's get started by taking a quick look at our very packed agenda. These are the topics here that we'll be covering in today's session. And as I said, my colleague Lauren and I will take you through the public side of things. Suzanne will explain drug coverage through private plans. And we apologize in advance for all the acronyms that you see on the screen here. You're going to see even more of them as we go through the slides, but we wanted to include them so that you'll know what they are when you hear them and what people are referring to when they're in use, in this space. So as you can see, we've set aside some time at the end for a brief Q&A. So if you wouldn't mind just noting down any questions that come to mind as we go, we can certainly address them at the end. There's an email address in the chat for you to send questions to after the fact if you think of any. And certainly through John and Tanya, we're happy to answer any questions that you may have. All right. Very complicated slide, but let's start with an overview or a snapshot of the journey that a drug takes from the time it is submitted to Health Canada until it gets into patients' hands. And there are a lot of steps, as you can see. The big public processes, public reimbursement processes, are in the purple or lavender boxes. And you can see that only health technology assessment is in a turquoise box. The reason for that is because it is the only formal opportunity for advocacy, for patients, caregivers, and physicians to provide input to any of these processes among all of them, including those on the private reimbursement side. And that's going to become important as we go through this. So we are going to walk through all of these processes in more detail. But first, let's just look at the different ways to access approved drugs. Okay, as you just saw on the previous slide, once a drug is approved in Canada, there are three possible pathways to access it. We have the public reimbursement process, which is when public drug plans that are government sponsored may reimburse some or all of the cost of the drug. And I'm saying some or all because sometimes there's a copay that individuals have to cover. Then we have the private pathway, and that's where private insurance, usually employer sponsored, may cover all or some of the cost of the drug. Again, there could be copays or maximum. Suzanne's going to talk about that in a minute. And then we have out of pocket, and that's when a patient can pay for an approved drug directly out of their own pocket. But I'll just add that this is often not possible, especially with higher cost drugs. So the other way to access an approved treatment is through compassionate access from the manufacturer. And this only occurs in certain circumstances. This is usually at no cost to the patient. And sometimes we see this when, while a drug is awaiting public or private reimbursement, a company may offer this. So we'll walk through the public and private pathways in detail during this webinar, but let's begin with Health Canada's regulatory review. So Health Canada conducts a review of a drug to assess three things: safety, efficacy, and quality. It begins when the manufacturer submits a new drug submission, files a new drug submission with Health Canada. Then Health Canada must accept that new drug submission before beginning its regulatory review of that product. So Health Canada does publish timelines. Timelines for all these processes are extremely important to all of us. We want to know how long things take. And so Health Canada lets us know that they have three timelines. One of them obviously being preferable, the priority review process, which is the shortest one at 180 days. But at the conclusion of all of these three processes, the manufacturer will be issued either a notice of compliance or a notice of compliance with conditions, an NOCC. And the NOCC just means that that Health Canada still requires some additional data, and that can be provided afterwards, but they want to go ahead and approve the drug so that it can start to go through the rest of the processes. And also importantly for you to know, there is no formal mechanism for patients and caregivers to provide input into the Health Canada regulatory process. Okay. It's also possible that a drug may be withdrawn from this process from Health Canada if they have concerns that cannot be resolved through available evidence and studies. This very rarely happens, but it does sometimes. And importantly, once a drug is approved by Health Canada, that means that it can be sold here once the drug is actually available, which is usually pretty soon after approval. So let's now talk quickly about drug pricing. We're not going to spend a lot of time on this, but we did want to call it to your attention. So most drugs that are approved in Canada are protected by patents. I'm sure that you've heard that before. So we have the Patented Medicine Prices Review Board, more easily called PMPRB, which is an independent quasi-judicial body that sits under Health Canada, and it monitors the prices of patented medicines sold in Canada to ensure that they are not excessive. So the Canadian list price, which the manufacturer sets, of a patented medicine is compared to the highest price reported by the following 11 countries that you see on your screen. If the Canadian list price of a patented medicine is determined by PMPRB to be excessive, it can order the company to lower the price and sometimes do other things. So what I wanted to call your attention to importantly here is that on June 30th of this year, PMPRB published its new guidelines for PMPRB staff to follow. It includes a new process. And these new guidelines come into effect on January 1st of 2026. But they took a long time to come to this point. And it was the result of multiple court proceedings that challenged the proposed amendments, which started in 2019, numerous consultations with stakeholders, and considerable advocacy. And I want to highlight the fact that CanPKU Plus's involvement in advocating around the new guidelines over the past 6 years is a great example of where formal and informal advocacy made a huge difference in the outcome. And also what's important to understand about this process is that the list price is not the final price that payers pay. but it is the maximum that payers, including Canadians who pay out of pocket, can be charged. And by the time you get to the end of these processes, the price that governments and private plan sponsors will pay will be considerably less for most drugs. So there you go. So before I hand it over to Lauren to go through some of these processes, I want to highlight some important changes that are minimizing delays between a new drug's regulatory approval from Health Canada and a reimbursement recommendation to public drug plans. So in recent years, manufacturers in this country have had the option to request something called an aligned or parallel review of a qualifying submission in partnership with Health Canada and the health technology assessment review process that Lauren's going to explain in a moment. So in particular, Canada's Drug Agency, which used to be called CADTH, you may remember that acronym, began accepting submissions up to 180 days before an anticipated regulatory decision by Health Canada. And that enabled draft reimbursement recommendations to be delivered to the manufacturer and payers between 3 and 28 days after the approval of the drug, which was a considerable savings in time. So between 21 and 2023, less than half of the drugs that were submitted by pharmaceutical companies for review to CDA, Health Technology Assessment, leveraged this aligned review process. And that led CDA to announce Target Zero, which is a new initiative that was launched last year that aims to further improve the time to access for patients in Canada for new drugs that are proven to be effective. Okay, and the goal of this program, as it is named, is to achieve 0 days between Health Canada's regulatory approval of a drug and CDA's reimbursement recommendation to participating drug plans. So we'll all be keeping a close eye on the impact of this program and how many manufacturers are taking advantage of it through the aligned review process. But we can say from our experience, we're already seeing this having an impact. And now I'm going to hand it over to Lauren, who's going to walk you through the HTA processes in more detail. Lauren? Oh.
Lauren, you're on mute. My goodness, thank you. All right, so thank you, Joanne. As Joanne mentioned, I'm going to explain Canada's HTA or Health Technology Assessments. In Canada, there are 2 agencies which conduct these reviews. Canada's Drug Agency, CDA, which conducts reviews for all of Canada, and INES, which is the process in Quebec. I will get into more detail on INES over the next couple of slides, but we're going to begin by speaking about CDA. So Canada's Drug Agency, formerly known as CADTH, conducts reimbursement reviews which assess the clinical effectiveness and cost effectiveness of a therapy, as well as patient and clinician perspectives on the drug under review. At the end of its review, it issues a non-binding recommendation, and that's a key part. It's a recommendation only to Canada's federal, provincial, and territorial governments to guide their funding decisions. Joanne is going to speak more about what that post-recommendation looks like, but at this stage, the outcomes are, again, I'm going to say recommendation to reimburse the drug, reimburse with criteria or conditions, or not to reimburse. Almost all the drugs that go through CDA receive a positive recommendation to reimburse, which will often have at least one condition. So it will be to reimburse with conditions, and that's typically a reduction in price. And that's something that's important to keep in mind when Suzanne explains a little bit more about private coverage. As Joanne mentioned off the top, HTA is one of the only opportunities for formal patient advocacy. And I'm going to touch on what that advocacy looks like in our next slide. As part of the process, CDA invites patient and clinician groups to provide their input and perspectives on the drug under review, as well as share about the nature of the disease, what the current treatment landscapes, and really paint a picture of the reality of living with and the care and treatment environment of the disease or disorder. And this is a vital opportunity as it provides patients and clinician groups that chance to speak to the lived reality and make sure their experiences are considered as part of the review process. For CDA, there are two opportunities for stakeholder input. The first opportunity is during the reimbursement review itself. So established patient and clinician groups are able to provide their perspective on the drug under review. There is a template which is provided, which I'm going to review on the coming slides. But it's important to note that individual patients and caregivers cannot comment directly. They can absolutely contribute to the patient group submission, but there is not an opportunity to contribute as an individual on your own. The second opportunity for CDA stakeholder input is once the draft recommendations are published. Once those recommendations are available, again, draft recommendations, patient and clinician groups are given 10 days to review them and provide any feedback they might have. So this is generally done by the groups who submitted the initial input, but not exclusively. So now I'm going to review what the templates for all of those processes look like. So here's a quick outline of the patient input template, what it looks like. We're not going to go into all of the detail, but the reason we want to share it with you is so that you can see it provides an opportunity for patients to speak to their experience with the disease, current treatment, what they would like to see achieved by a new treatment, and their perspective on the actual drug under review. So a chance to speak to gaps in current treatment environment and what you would like to see in the future. A quick snapshot of the CDA clinician input template, you will see it focuses more on that clinical experience. So, excuse me, ask a bit more about current treatment, gaps in care, and how the new treatment under review would fit into the overall treatment environment. And then lastly, here's a snapshot of the draft recommendation feedback template. So this is to be used once the draft recommendations are out. The same template is used by patient and clinician groups. The way this template is set up is yes or no questions with an option to provide comments. So for example, do you agree with these draft considerations or these draft recommendations? And then the response could be, yes, we agree, but here are some considerations. No, we don't agree. This is why, etc., etc. So this wraps up CDA at a high level, and now I'm going to touch on INESS. So as quickly mentioned, INESS has its own process for conducting HTA reviews, and that is called INESS. Similar to CDA, INESS reviews a drug for therapeutic value and cost effectiveness. However, unlike CDA, the INESS recommendation does not go to all federal, provincial, and territorial governments. It's used by the formulary in Quebec and has to be signed off by the Quebec Minister of Health. You'll see in the next stages where Quebec and the rest of Canada come together, but for these HTA assessments, they are done separately. Like CDA, though, INESS also has an opportunity for stakeholder input, but there are some key differences. INESS stakeholder input similarly is open to patient groups and clinician groups, but at INES, there is an option for individual patients and caregivers to provide their feedback directly. However, there is only one opportunity to provide feedback, and that is while the drug is under review. So there are no draft recommendations in the INES process for feedback. It's only one opportunity while the review is underway. There is also no template provided for clinicians. So clinicians are free to submit their feedback in the format that they feel is appropriate, but patients and caregivers, individuals or groups, do have a template that they are asked to follow, which I'm going to wrap up by showing you quickly here, similarly to the CDA input templates. You'll see again, it follows a very similar line of questions, asking about disease experience, currently available treatments, and any experience the patient group, caregivers, or individuals have had with the drug under review. But a key difference is that INES, the template specifically asks you to provide 5 summary points at the end of your input. So with that, quick overview of those templates and this opportunity for patient input, I'm going to hand it back to Joanne, and she's going to review the final steps in the reimbursement process once the CDA and INES recommendations have been made. So Joanne, over to you.
Perfect. Thank you, Lauren. Okay, we're almost done with public, and then it'll be over to private coverage. So the second last step in the public reimbursement process is affectionately known as PCPA. So the Pan-Canadian Pharmaceutical Alliance conducts joint reimbursement negotiations with, get this, 19 federal, provincial, and territorial drug plans, 19. All drugs that have a positive CDA recommendation that Lauren just walked you through, a final recommendation that is positive from CDA, are considered for negotiation through the PCPA. A lead jurisdiction, or sometimes more than one, is chosen for each negotiation. But this, unfortunately, is not something that is transparent to the public, to us. So if we go on to the the PCPA website, we can see that a drug is perhaps being considered for negotiation, but we can't see when a lead jurisdiction has been identified and who that is. So that's important to note just from an advocacy perspective, but we'll talk about that more on another webinar. And the other thing to note is that PCPA member jurisdictions can opt out of participating in any stage of this process. So all of these 19 drug plans, in theory, sit around the PCPA table and have the opportunity to negotiate, but they can decide not to at any point along the way. And again, something else that is not transparent to us. So we will not know which drug plan is participating in negotiations. So in the little turquoise box, just wanted to call out that PCPA member jurisdictions include drug plans, public drug plans, participation from all 13 provinces and territories, including Quebec. As Lauren mentioned, Quebec now rejoins the process, so everybody's negotiating all together. The Government of Canada, which covers about 1 million Canadians through its 6 public drug plans. So some of the Canadians covered through these federal drug plans, in case you're curious, include First Nations and Inuit peoples, members of the Canadian Armed Forces, qualified veterans, members of the RCMP, and offenders in federal correctional institutions, as well as some designated migrants. So now let's take a look at the PCPA's process in more detail. See, these acronyms get you after a while. So basically, there are 4 steps to the process. What you see on the right-hand side, I think, or of your screen is, all the sort of steps and a little bit of a flow chart, but let's just walk through what the 4 main steps are now. So PCPA initiates or begins its process by issuing an acknowledgement letter to the manufacturer. This usually happens very soon after CDA issues its final recommendation. And then they begin to consider whether or not they will actually enter into negotiations on a particular drug with a particular manufacturer. If they decide to go ahead with negotiations, PCPA issues an engagement letter to the manufacturer, and this is when they assign that lead jurisdiction or jurisdictions to lead this work. And then the whole process is completed when negotiations are concluded, but the outcome can be two different things. One, if negotiations go well and they're successful, PCPA will issue a letter of intent, which is signed by as many of the participating jurisdictions as would like to sign it, and that is given to the manufacturer. Manufacturer also signs. But if negotiations are concluded without an agreement, there is no letter of intent, and negotiations stop, and then we're in a bit of a limbo space that we don't want to be in at any time. So, like CDA, PCPA has been making efforts to expedite its process as well. Even though it doesn't publish specific timelines, we have a sense of how long they typically take. And recently, they announced an initiative to start to shorten that timeline, and that's called the early negotiation process. Now, I'm not going to get into the details on this now because at the moment, it's only being applied to certain cancer drugs, but we do hope that soon it will be applied to rare disease drugs who certainly have a high need for timelines to be expedited. All right, and so finally, we've reached the last step in the public process, which is the signing of product listing agreements, or PLAs as we call them. So, PLAs, each of the 19 public drug plans, provincial, territorial, and federal that we just talked about, conduct their own reviews sometimes and negotiations all the time with manufacturers to determine if and how a drug is going to be covered in that jurisdiction within that drug plan. Okay. Now, it doesn't mean that all of them do this because, again, they have a choice. They cannot, sign a PLA with the manufacturer. But some jurisdictions do invite patient groups at this point, or even individual patients, to provide input before making a listing decision. So, for example, in BC PharmaCare has a program called Your Voice, where at this stage, they welcome input from patient groups and individuals. So also important to note that is the jurisdiction's health authority, typically the Ministry of Health, the Minister of Health, who makes the final decision about public drug plan coverage. And funding criteria can vary from drug plan to drug plan, province to province, to territory, to federal plan. And I think many of you will know the term that we often use in this country called the postal code lottery, and that's really where that comes into play. Some people have to move to get access to treatment. That is just the reality, unfortunately. So a PLA is often based on the content that's contained in the PCPA letter of intent that we just discussed. And that's important because advocacy, right? At every stage in these processes, we want to be making sure that payers understand the importance of the need for these treatments and how they can benefit them so that the right criteria are applied, to funding decisions. Some jurisdictions also of note have special committees to determine access to certain drugs on a case-by-case basis if these drugs are not added to the general list or the general formulary. And an example of that is here in Ontario, we have something called the Exceptional Access Program, EAP, that many rare disease drugs go through, are funded through, as opposed to the general list formulary. So the key takeaway here is that drug plans have no requirement to negotiate coming out of PCPA, even if they sign the letter of intent to fund a drug. Product listings are also negotiated with private drug plans. And that's why we're going to discuss that right now to complete the picture of drug funding in Canada. And to help us with that, I will pass it over to our private plan expert, Suzanne Lepage, to give you a high-level overview. Suzanne?
Thank you, Joanne. So private payers are a bit of a black box for a lot of people, and I'm going to try to demystify that. I've worked in the private insurance industry and consulted for a long time. So we'll start off similar to what we did with public, and we'll look at an overview of what that looks like. Lauren, if you could advance, great. So we have all these different stages with private payers that are similar but different, and we're going to talk about each one in a little bit more detail. So if we move forward, one of the things that it's important to understand is there's so many stakeholders in this private payer world. And, you know, I have plan sponsors circled in red. In the insurance industry, a plan sponsor is the organization that chooses and pays for the benefit plan design, the benefit plan. And usually that's an employer-sponsored plan, but if you're unionized, maybe it's your union that manages it. Or if you're part of like an association, that could be part of it as well. They provide the benefits to the plan members and are often influenced by unions. Most of the plan sponsors use something we call a benefit plan advisor, which is no different than a financial advisor for your personal finances. They provide advice on what kind of plan they should have, how much they should pay, and the claims, the contract is set up with the insurer or pharmacy benefit manager, who then manages the adjudication or the processing of a claim at the pharmacy level. And so all of these stakeholders have a role to play, but I think one of the differences that's important to note is that the ultimate payer is the plan sponsor. We often think of the insurers, the big insurers, to be the payer, and really they are providing a service to the plan sponsor who chooses the benefit plan and pays for the benefit plan. So if we move forward, again, I guess it's this is one of those builds. Yeah, thank you. So the two things that I always like to remind people of is I view market access is the step of getting a drug listed on a formulary. So we'll talk about the different types of formulary in a minute. Just because a drug is listed on an insurer's formulary doesn't mean that the patients automatically get access to it, because each plan is different by plan sponsor. And so you can have market access, but maybe not patient access. And I think that'll become clearer as we move along. So I have the snowflake on this slide because I like to remind people that no two drug plans are the same. Each private plan is unique, even within one insurer. So you'll often hear people say, is drug A covered by Green Shield? And you could have some plans with that insurer that cover it and some don't, because the plan sponsor chooses the plan design. So even within one company, you could have a different drug plan between the management and the union, for example, or multiple unions. Or you may have a situation where you have flexible benefits so that each employee can choose their own coverage. So you can have two employees that are in the same class but have different coverage. And then each insurer has to offer a wide variety of plans to meet different needs. And so they have different prices for different plans. Some plans may cover an expense and another plan with that same insurer may not. So it's really important not to get caught up in the discussion about does this insurer cover it or not? What you really need to think about is, does your plan cover or not? And we'll talk about that. So the big question that I always get asked is, how do we find out if the drug is covered? Well, behind the scenes, like any big organization, there's a lot of coding that goes into the systems. But what happens is that if you present your drug card at the pharmacy, and it'll have a group number and it'll have a certificate number, and the pharmacist kicks in the DIN into the system in real time, like 30 seconds or less, it will tell the pharmacist whether the drug is covered, not covered, or may require prior authorization. But there's a lot of factors that go into determining if the drug is covered. And this is what I'm going to share with you today. So there's really two main components to a private drug plan. And the first one is the formulary. And that really, at the end of the day, is just a list of drugs that are covered. So the plan sponsor will choose which of the formularies they want, and the payer who offers the formularies will decide which drugs go on each formulary. So the analogy I like to make, it's like your mutual fund or your retirement savings plan. You choose a fund, but then the fund manager decides which stocks go into that. So that's one piece of your benefit plan. And the other one is the plan design, which is how that drug is covered. And so again, I'm going to show you a variety of plan designs. So that could be co-insurance, maximums, generic drug plans. Each plan sponsor chooses their own. And the variations, like this looks like a simple matrix, but having worked in the industry, there can be thousands, hundreds or thousands of variations on these. So again, knowing these components of your plan will help determine whether or not a drug is covered. So first of all, the formulary. So that's a list of prescriptions drugs covered by a health insurance plan. And Lauren, if you there's 3 boxes you can just populate. So there's the first one is prescription by law. So in the past, this would cover all drugs require prescription, often called an open plan. I put an asterisk here because this term is still in circulation. But if you ask anybody in the insurance business, there's truly no open plans for specialty drugs. They'll all be reviewed and assessed, very similar to how the government does it. You might have a private plan that mimics the provincial plan. So if you live in Ontario, the private plan mimics the Ontario drug benefit. And then if you live in BC, the private plan mimics the BC formulary. And the last one is a managed formulary where a private payer drug review committee determines which drugs are covered. Again, your plan sponsor will choose which one of these they want. However, again, I have 3 broad categories here, but this multiplies into 80 to 150 different drug plans that have slight variations. But this is usually where you stop and see, okay, what kind of formulary does my plan have? And so these are the 3 common ones. Lauren, if you move forward. So the formulary review that happens is really a process where the committee at each insurer or pharmacy benefit manager looks at a new drug and says, yes, it's covered. No, it's not covered, or maybe. And I think there's a build here. Yeah. And the maybe is where prior authorization is used. So they might say, this would be appropriate use if the patient had X, Y, and Z criteria met. And so maybe allows for more individual review by patient to determine if they're eligible or not. So this is really how the formulary review committee reviews the drug. And again, remember there's multiple formularies. So the decision for formulary 1 could be yes. The decision for formulary 2 could be no. And for 3, it might be prior authorization. So again, there's multiple complexities. This looks like a binary decision, but again, I think there's a build after this one, Lauren. Oh, no, but we can say is that this happens like, I guess, 100 times for the different formulary reviews. So again, it's more complex. Next slide. So the other thing that's happened over the years, and this is something that you may not see yourself, but it's important to note, is that most of the insurers have implemented what we call delayed listing programs, where they are taking the time. So I have 3 insurers up here, but this is done at most insurers. These are the big 3. They'll put through high impact drugs through a much more rigorous review program. There's no transparency where a drug stands, what the timing is, what the outcomes are, what the rationale is. There's very little communication with pharma companies or with patient groups. We see situations where this can take 6 to 12 months or more to review. They might wait for the CADIT or the Canadian Drug Agency decision. They may require a product listing agreement with the pharmaceutical manufacturer, and sometimes they have specialized programs. So this adds a layer of complexity the thing that's really different about private versus public is you can usually go to the CDA website or the PCPA website and see what the queue looks like. You can't do that with the private payer. So this is frustrating for a lot of people. So again, Laura, I'm going to ask you to build all these. We're not going to go into these today, but the plan design is the adjudication rules that are chosen by the plan sponsor and adjudicated by the payer. And you can see that there's a lot of moving parts that relate to the drug plan that will affect the reimbursement. So for example, I'm just going to pick one, a plan maximum. A drug can be listed, right? So it's on the formulary. But if the patient's plan has a $10,000 maximum, you know, the quality of that coverage varies, right? So these are factors that need to be consideration that affect the drug choice, that affect cost sharing or the cost of the drug. And so this is separate from the formulary, but together determine access to the medication. Again, yeah. So private payer timelines for reimbursement is very hard to determine because it's not published anywhere. Innovative Medicines Canada, which is an association for the pharmaceutical industry, has done a survey to track about how long it might take to get a drug reimbursed on a private plan. And specialty drugs can be up to 12 plus months. And then if you go to oncology or drugs for rare disease, it could be 18 months or more. And then there's the additional layer of prior authorization approval, which can take an additional 5 weeks. So this isn't insignificant because it really affects access to medications. On the next slide, I just provide a timeline that, you know, just confirms some of these steps, is that any one of these steps along the way can delay access. So notice of a compliance is the Health Canada approval. Submission means sending, the pharmaceutical company sends a dossier to the private payer. The payer reviews it, they negotiate a product listing agreement, and then we get a listing. The one thing I'll pause and note, whereas Joanne highlighted opportunities for patient input, there is not a process at all for patient input on any of the private payer reviews. I know that Joanne and I have talked about that process ideally would be changed, but for now, all these steps are just handled between the pharmaceutical company and the payer. So coming back to the drug claim adjudication, oftentimes we see a situation where the drug is not covered. And this is why, you know, how do we get access? And we're going to talk about this next time we're together, but if you go to the next slide. The challenge is when a drug isn't covered, and we'll talk about this next time, is we have to figure out where in that process did we determine that the drug was not covered, to determine what the next steps will look like. So stay tuned, because the next time we get together, I'll give you some tips and tricks about accessing your own coverage with your own private plan. Over to
Perfect. Thanks, Suzanne. That's great. So much and great information, certainly for a process that we, most of us don't know much about. So let's try and summarize. We thought we would come back to this slide because it has all the information in one place. And now that you have an understanding of all of the processes and the steps involved, it may not surprise you to learn that in total, it could take anywhere from 2 to 3 years for a drug to be funded on the public side, on the private side. It could take longer, and in some cases, a drug may not ever be funded, or not for a long time. So this is really why advocacy is so important, both formal, like the opportunities that we have with CDA and ENS to provide input into those processes, but also informal, where you can make your own opportunities for advocacy, working with groups like CanPKU+, and on the public and private side for coverage of the treatments that you and your families need. And that is exactly, as Suzanne just said, what we'll be learning about in the next webinar, which is called Your Voice Matters: How to Become an Effective Advocate.